Part 1 Extended. For 3 long years, the grand halls of Victor Carolin's mansion echoed with silence. Not the peaceful kind, the painful kind. The mansion stood on a hill overlooking the river, all glass walls and marble floors, designed by famous architects whose names Victor liked to mention in interviews. Chandeliers from Italy hung above staircases carved from white stone. A grand piano rested near panoramic windows that framed sunsets like priceless paintings. It was a house built to impress. But inside it lived a child who had not spoken in 3 years. Alina Carolin had once been a whirlwind of sound. She used to run through the corridors with ribbons in her hair, singing nonsense songs, asking endless questions. Why do clouds move? Why does Papa work so much? Can we have 3 dogs instead of 1? Then came the night of rain. The crash. The flashing lights. The hospital corridors that smelled of antiseptic and loss. Alina survived with a few bruises and a thin scar near her collarbone. Her mother did not survive at all. At first, everyone thought the silence was shock. She clung to Victor's hand in the hospital but refused to answer the nurses. Days passed. Weeks. At the funeral, she stared at the closed casket and said nothing. Then she whispered less. Then not at all. Doctors called it trauma-induced mutism. Some promised breakthroughs with the right therapy. Others warned Victor to be patient. One elderly psychiatrist said quietly, "She has locked something inside. And she will only unlock it when she feels safe enough." Safe. Victor replayed that word often. He installed more security cameras. Hired private guards. Upgraded the gates. As if safety could be bought in steel and passwords. He scheduled therapy sessions in rooms decorated with pastel walls and soft toys. Specialists flew in from Europe. One tried play therapy. Another tried hypnosis. A third insisted on medication. Alina sat still through all of it. Her gray eyes followed movements. She responded to instructions with nods or shakes of her head. She ate, dressed, and slept without protest. She did her schoolwork perfectly. But she did not speak. The nannies lasted weeks at best. One complained that Alina's silence was unnerving. Another accused her of being manipulative. A third tried to force conversation by withholding dessert. Victor fired them all. At dinner, the long table designed for 12 felt absurd with just 2 people at opposite ends. The sound of cutlery against porcelain seemed too loud. "Alina," he would try sometimes, voice softer than it ever was in business meetings. "Do you want to go to the seaside this summer?" She would shrug. "Do you miss Mama?" Her fingers would freeze around her spoon. Her eyes would lower. He learned not to ask. Instead, he buried himself in work. Construction projects. New partnerships. Expanding into neighboring cities. It was easier to control concrete and contracts than grief. But at night, when the mansion quieted, he sometimes stood outside her bedroom door. Listening, hoping, nothing, until the afternoon Nina Ivanovna arrived. Maria, the regular housekeeper, had worked in the mansion for years. Reliable, invisible, efficient. That morning she had called in sick. "My mother will come instead," Maria had said nervously. "Just for today," she insisted. Victor had frowned. The mansion was not a place for random substitutions. But he was late for a meeting and waved it off. "Fine, just make sure she doesn't wander." When Nina Ivanovna stepped through the iron gates, the guards exchanged skeptical glances. She was small and slightly bent with age. Her coat had been mended at the elbows. Her boots carried traces of old mud despite being wiped carefully at the entrance. A faded floral scarf framed her lined face. But her eyes were alive. Curious. Calm. She paused in the foyer, looking up at the chandelier with quiet admiration, not envy, not judgment. "Beautiful," she murmured to herself. Alina was seated near the grand piano, as she often was. She liked to press the keys softly when she thought no one listened. Never melodies, just scattered notes. Nina noticed her immediately. Most adults entered the room and stiffened around Alina, unsure how to behave around a child who would not speak. Nina did not stiffen. She did not approach immediately either. Instead, she placed her cloth bag gently on a side table, removed her coat, and rolled up her sleeves. Her movements were unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world. She began dusting shelves, humming a low, cracked melody, an old lullaby from decades past. The tune carried warmth despite the age in her voice. Alina's fingers paused above the piano keys. The humming continued. After a while, Nina lowered herself carefully onto the carpet, her knees protesting softly. From her bag she pulled out bright yarn, red, yellow, blue, and knitting needles. Click, click, click. The rhythmic sound blended with the ticking of the grandfather clock. Alina turned her head. No one had ever come into this house and behaved as if it were ordinary. Nina didn't glance at her immediately. She simply knitted. After several minutes, she spoke, but not directly to Alina. My granddaughter once decided the world was too loud, she said thoughtfully, eyes on the yarn. So she made it quiet. Alina blinked. No therapist had ever spoken like that. They told her to speak, Nina continued calmly. But she said nothing, because sometimes silence feels safer than words. The knitting needles clicked again. I learned something then, Nina added. You cannot pull words out of someone. They are not weeds. They are seeds. Alina's breathing shifted, subtle but real. Nina's hands moved steadily. The yarn began forming shape. Small wings, a rounded body. When seeds are buried, Nina said softly, it doesn't mean they are dead. It means they are waiting. A faint tremor ran through Alina's fingers. Nina finally lifted her gaze, not sharply, not intensely, just a gentle glance. Gray eyes met wise brown ones. No pity, no pressure, just understanding. She finished the small creation and held it up, a bright yellow knitted bird. Slightly crooked, imperfect, she placed it beside Alina on the piano bench. For when the spring comes, Nina said simply. Alina stared at the bird. No one asked her to respond. No one leaned forward expectantly. Nina stood slowly, joints cracking softly, and returned to dusting shelves. The room felt different. Not heavy, not strained, just shared. When Victor returned that evening, he found Alina in her bedroom. The yellow bird lay in her lap. Her fingers traced its wings. He picked it up carefully. Who gave you this? He asked. She did not answer, of course. But she did not look away either. That night, for the first time in years, Victor heard something unusual through her door. Not words, but a sound, soft, fragile, almost like the beginning of a hum. Part 2 extended. The sound Victor heard that night was so faint he almost convinced himself he had imagined it. He stood outside Alina's bedroom door long after the mansion had fallen asleep, his hand hovering inches from the handle. For 3 years he had listened to nothing but stillness. Now there had been something, a fragile vibration, like wind brushing through dry leaves. He did not enter. He was afraid that even his breath might scare it away. The next morning, Nina Ivanovna returned. No announcement, no ceremony, just the soft knock at the servant's entrance and the shuffle of careful footsteps across polished marble. Alina was already waiting by the piano. Not playing, waiting. Nina noticed, but she did not comment. She set her bag down and began her usual routine. Dusting frames, straightening books, humming that same old lullaby. Click, click, click. The knitting resumed. This time, the yarn was green. Victor watched from the study balcony above, pretending to review documents. In reality, he had cancelled 2 meetings. Something told him this mattered more than contracts. Nina spoke casually into the air. You know, she said, looping yarn around needle, when my husband died, I stopped singing. Alina's shoulders stiffened slightly. I thought if I didn't sing, I wouldn't remember him, Nina continued. But the silence was louder than any song. The green yarn began forming what looked like leaves. I blamed myself, she added. For not forcing him to see a doctor sooner. For not insisting he rest. For foolish little things. The word blame seemed to linger in the room. Alina's fingers tightened around the yellow bird she now carried everywhere. Nina did not look at her. But grief, the old woman said gently, as a tricky storyteller. It whispers lies. It tells children they could have stopped storms. The mansion felt smaller. Alina's breathing grew uneven. Victor gripped the balcony railing. Nina set the knitting down and reached into her bag, pulling out the wooden box again. She placed the fox and rabbit on the carpet. The fox has a secret, she announced softly. She made the fox bow its head. He thinks the storm came because he spoke too loudly in the car. The air disappeared from Victor's lungs. Alina's lips parted slightly. The rabbit, Nina continued, moving the small gray figure closer, knows storms don't listen to children. The fox remained still. The fox thinks if he had been quieter, or louder, or braver, Nina's voice thinned but never broke, the storm would have turned away. A tear slid down Alina's cheek. She wiped it quickly, almost angrily. Nina leaned back, giving space. The rabbit sits, she said. He doesn't argue. He just stays. Silence. But not the old, suffocating silence. This one trembled. Alina slowly placed the yellow bird beside the rabbit. Her fingers hovered over the fox. And then, barely audible, her voice cracked the air. I told her, not to drive fast. The words scraped out like they had been buried in stone. Victor staggered backward as if struck. Nina did not gasp, did not lunge forward, she only nodded gently. The fox tried to protect his mama, she said. That is what loving children do. Alina's face crumpled. I shouted, she whispered, each syllable fragile. She looked back, at me. Her small hands began to shake. And then, the rest dissolved into sobs. Victor rushed down the stairs, no longer able to remain hidden. He dropped to his knees beside his daughter. It wasn't you, he said, his voice breaking completely. Alina, listen to me. It was not you. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in years, there was no wall in her eyes. I made her look, she cried. No, Victor whispered fiercely. She looked because she loved you. Not because you caused anything. Nina quietly gathered the fox and rabbit but left them within reach. Storms come, she said softly. Drivers make mistakes. Roads are slippery. But love is never the cause of loss. Alina's sobs turned into deep, shaking breaths, the kind that empty years of trapped fear. Victor pulled her into his arms. She clung to him, fingers digging into his suit jacket as if anchoring herself to something solid. I was scared, she admitted in broken pieces. If I talked, it would happen again. There it was. The truth. Silence had been her shield. If she didn't speak, she couldn't distract anyone. Couldn't cause harm. Couldn't create another storm. Victor pressed his forehead to hers. You could scream every second of your life, he said hoarsely, and it would never bring another accident. You are not that powerful, my love. A tiny, trembling laugh escaped her through tears. The first hint of light. Nina resumed knitting, giving father and daughter space to rediscover each other. Days passed differently after that. Alina did not suddenly become the chatterbox she once was. Her voice returned slowly, like cautious sunlight after winter. One word the next morning. 2 sentences the day after. Sometimes she stopped mid-phrase, panic flickering in her eyes. Each time, Victor stayed calm. You're safe, he would remind her. And Nina would hum. Within weeks, the mansion felt transformed. Laughter echoed uncertainly at first, then more freely. Alina began asking small questions again. Papa, did Mama like yellow? Yes, Victor smiled. Very much. Can we plant flowers? We'll plant a whole garden. One afternoon, Victor approached Nina with an envelope thick enough to change anyone's life. You saved her, he said, voice steady but emotional. Please, let me help you. Nina closed his fingers gently over the envelope. I didn't save her, she replied. I waited with her. She turned to Alina, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor, carefully holding a new knitted creation, a small green stem with a bright flower at the top. Seeds, Nina reminded her with a wink. Alina smiled, fully, openly. Seeds, she repeated. The word rang through the mansion like a promise. And Victor realized something no therapist had managed to teach him. Healing was not bought. It was grown, slowly, patiently, in warmth. And sometimes, all it took to break years of silence, was someone brave enough to sit quietly beside it.